Hey you, and welcome. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Firebase dashboard and get it ready for production use. So let's dive right into it. I have the Firebase dashboard open, and in that, let me just make this a little bigger. In this dashboard already, we're seeing some useful information right on the dashboard, and that's the main page. And we can see the hosting card, there's a Firestore card function. So whichever module you end up using, whichever product you end up using, they put a card for that. And that's pretty useful. I will go back to the sidebar. And what we'll do is first things first, let's take a look at hosting. In the hosting, that's where you can find your URL. So if you're ever sharing the project to see like, hey, take a look at this, I built this. This is where you can find the URLs. Both the URLs work. This one's a little smaller, so I would of course go with that. If you want to have a personal URL that is yourname.com or subdomain.yourname.com, you can add a custom domain. It's a very easy wizard to follow, and you can add the domain here. You can also find a new domain, purchase it through Google, and the prices are pretty competitive, should be just fine. So I'm not going to do that for this one, but just know that this is also an option. Underneath, we can see how many deploys we have done throughout our journey, and we can also roll back to any of these if you'd like. By clicking on the three dot, you can roll back, which is very useful. If you ever push code that breaks your app and you're panicking, just roll back to the previous version so panic can stop, and at least you can fix the bug offline. All right, so that's the hosting section. Let's go over to functions. For functions, some things that are very useful is how do we know if the function is working, if it's breaking, how do we know what's breaking about it? So that's where the logs come in handy. If you click on the three dots on the right hand side of the function that you want to diagnose, you can click on view logs, and it will take you to the GCP console. And inside that, where you can see all the calls that are ever made, if you want to expand it, you can click on the call itself. It will tell you what happened, when the call was made, what time, what was it called for. So there's tons of things here. It's very, very detailed. You can also use a functions logger in the function itself and deploy that to say, every time this event happens, log this to the log, and then you can see it later on. So it's good for logging purposes and diagnostic purposes. All right, I'm going to close this out, go back to my function section. We can also see usage of the function, and I believe most of the usage will be within, or actually all the usage will be within our free tier, so you don't really have to worry about it, but you can also see how many times we call the function. In this case, there was only one, so that means that function got called 85 times just by me testing. All right. Next thing, let's take a look at the Firestore database. Now this one is very important because before you go to production, make sure in the rules section, the rule is changed back to not being in test mode. Remember when we created Firestore, we selected test mode. What it did for us is allowed us to write to the database without being authenticated. That's why we were able to create contacts before we added authentication layer to our app. So let's change that. I have the Firebase documentation open. In the Firebase Cloud Firestore Secure, Validate, and Get Started, that's the section where you can find the required authentication required rule. You can simply copy paste the whole thing, or I know that I only need just this line right here. So if request.auth is not null, then allow the person to read and write, which is okay for us. So that's right there. Make sure it's copy pasted and publish. Oh, it will complain. I think there's two if statements. There we are. So it also catches that for us. If I was to publish, it will catch that for me and stop me from publishing it. So I can publish that. There's also a history of these changes, so I can roll back to any of these. If I made a mistake in the rule, just roll it back, and that works. So in this case now, if I was to test the app again, the app should still work. I should still be able to see my contacts. So nothing broke is because we're using the authentication, but if we weren't, the app would break. So make sure you're using authentication if you enable the production mode. So that secures our database and is ready to go to production. We can also see usage, and it will tell you whether there's any cost to that usage. It will tell you how many reads and write happen, so you can find out how well your app is doing and how many requests are being made through your app. All right. Let's go to sidebar again. Let's go over to, I'm going to skip over authentication. There's not much to talk about there, but let's go to storage. We do have to make an important change there as well. This one has the rules section as well. And remember, we selected test mode at that time. So that means the same thing is happening here as the database, and we need to make this change before we go to production. That means nobody without authentication should be able to upload anything to my storage or be able to see anything from my storage. All right, so let's go back to the documentation, copy that line again, and replace it right here like so, and publish. With that done, let's go to the sidebar. There's not much else to talk about the storage section. So in the sidebar, let's take a look at analytics. That was one more thing I wanted to show. We didn't do much with analytics. We just imported Firebase SDK, and that did some analytics for us. And we can see some useful data, like how many users are coming in. Is it the same user again and again, which in my case it was always me. And if I scroll further down, it will tell me how long the session was alive, which app were they using, were there any crashes. In this case there was one crash, or no, there was no crashes, crash-free users, and user retention, page views, what was the app name, which app did they use. So if you have multiple app faces, like one web app, one mobile app, one mobile app would have Android app, iOS app, then all these apps you can see how many users are coming from each app to see which app is more important to work on the features first rather than the other ones. So there's tons of information right there available without having to do much. But analytics API is its own thing where you can add more events to it to give more data later on. All right. With that out of the way, I think that's about it. I'll see you all in the next video.